They say dogs can sense things humans cannot. The approach of storms, the presence of danger, the shadow of death itself. But what happened at Officer Michael Carter's funeral defied everything anyone thought they knew about the bond between man and animal. The German shepherd's barking started as a whisper of grief. It ended with a discovery so shocking, so impossible, that every person in that chapel would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they witnessed. Some would call it a miracle. Others would call it divine intervention. But everyone agreed on one thing. What Max uncovered in that sealed coffin should not have been possible. This is the true story of a dog who refused to stay silent, a fallen officer's final mission, and a secret so profound it would restore an entire community's faith in the power of love to transcend even death itself. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you believe about loyalty, sacrifice, and the lengths one man would go to protect the most vulnerable life he'd ever encountered. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary acts of heroism happen in our final moments. Sometimes, a bark isn't just a sound, it's a message from beyond. And sometimes, death doesn't get the last word. This is that story. But before we begin, if you love incredible true stories about loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We share the most heartwarming and inspiring stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this story, and we have so many more like it waiting for you. Now, let's go back to that fateful day at St. Thomas's Chapel, where hundreds gathered to say goodbye to a hero, and where one faithful dog was about to reveal a secret that would leave them all speechless. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the polished wooden pews of St. Michael's Chapel. Outside, autumn leaves tumbled across the parking lot, their rustle the only sound breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the small town like a shroud. Today was a day no one had wanted to come. Today was the day they would say goodbye to one of their own. Officer Michael Carter's funeral had drawn what seemed like the entire community, a sea of dress blues and tear-stained faces, of folded flags and trembling hands clutching handkerchiefs. The chapel, built to hold maybe 200, had swelled to nearly 400 souls, with mourners spilling out into the vestibule and onto the front steps. Local news vans lined the street outside, their presence a testament to the man being honored, though their cameras remained respectfully dark. Daniel had been more than a decorated officer. He had been the kind of man who remembered everyone's name, who showed up to Little League games for kids whose fathers were absent, who worked double shifts during the holidays so younger officers could be with their families. His smile had been genuine, his handshake firm, his word ironclad. And now he was gone, taken too soon in a way that still didn't make sense to anyone gathered here. At the front of the chapel, beneath an elaborate spray of white lilies and blue forget-me-nots, stood the mahogany casket. The American flag draped across it had been folded with military precision, its stars gleaming under the soft chapel lights. Photographs surrounded the casket, Daniel in his academy uniform, young and eager, Daniel receiving his badge, Daniel on his wedding day, looking at his bride Sarah as if she hung the moon, Daniel with his arm around Max, both of them grinning after solving their first major case together. And there, at the foot of the casket, sat the reason some people had come as much to witness as to mourn. Max. The German shepherd sat at perfect attention, his muscular frame rigid, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on something only he could see. His black tactical vest bore the word police in bold white letters, and pinned to it was Daniel's badge, badge number 347, placed there by the chief himself during the private viewing. Max's fur, normally glossy and well-groomed, seemed duller today, as if grief had stolen some of his vitality. His ears, those magnificent radars that could detect a threat from 50 yards away, twitched occasionally at the whispered conversations around him, but his gaze never wavered from the casket. Officer James Parker Bryant, Daniel's partner before Max had taken that role, stood nearby, his own eyes red-rimmed and puffy. He'd been assigned to watch over Max during the service, though he suspected it was as much for his benefit as for the dog's. Having a job, a purpose, kept the crushing weight of loss from becoming unbearable. He glanced down at Max and felt his throat tighten. The dog hadn't eaten in 3 days. "He knows," the canine handler had told Bryant that morning. "Dogs, especially working dogs like Max, they understand death better than we give them credit for. He's mourning." Bryant had nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He'd seen soldiers mourn their fallen brothers, had stood at enough police funerals to know the particular flavor of this kind of grief. But watching Max, watching this magnificent animal who had been Daniel's shadow, his protector, his partner in the truest sense, was somehow worse. Max couldn't understand why Daniel wouldn't throw his ball anymore, couldn't comprehend why that familiar voice wouldn't call his name at shift change, couldn't process why the world suddenly felt so empty. The chapel filled slowly, like water rising. Sarah Granger sat in the front pew, flanked by Daniel's parents and her own. She wore a simple black dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a bun, her face carefully composed in that way people manage when they've cried so much, their bodies simply have nothing left. She'd been the one to identify Daniel's body 4 days ago, in the cold sterility of the county morgue. She'd been the one to pick out the casket, choose the flowers, write the obituary that couldn't possibly capture the man he'd been. She'd been the one to wake up every morning since to an empty bed and the devastating realization that this wasn't a nightmare. It was her new reality. Now she stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap, her wedding ring catching the light. In her mind, she kept replaying the last conversation she'd had with Daniel. It had been so mundane, so ordinary. He'd kissed her goodbye, told her he loved her, promised to pick up milk on the way home. The banality of it felt like a betrayal. Last words should be profound, meaningful, final. Instead, they'd been about milk. The priest, Father Thomas Sullivan, stood at the pulpit, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the assembled crowd. He'd baptized Daniel 28 years ago, had presided over his first communion, his confirmation, his wedding. Now this. The circular nature of his ministry had never felt so painful. The organ began to play, a mournful rendition of Amazing Grace that seemed to reach into every heart present and squeeze. People shifted in their seats, pulled out tissues, cleared their throats against the rising emotion. The service was about to begin. And that's when Max started whining. Part 2. The First Warning. At first, it was barely audible, a soft, keening sound that came from somewhere deep in Max's chest. Bryant looked down, concerned, and placed a hand on the dog's head. Max's ears had flattened against his skull, and a tremor ran through his body. "Easy, boy," Bryant whispered, his voice low and soothing. I know it's hard." But the whining didn't stop. If anything, it grew more insistent, more urgent. People in the front pews began to turn, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. A few of Daniel's fellow officers exchanged knowing glances. They'd all seen canines mourn before, had witnessed the profound bond between handler and dog. This was grief, pure and simple. Heartbreaking but not unexpected. Father O'Connor paused in his opening remarks, his eyes drifting to Max with a compassion born of decades shepherding people through loss. "Even our four-legged friends feel the sting of death," he said gently, his Irish brogue thickening with emotion. "That we are all here, gathered together, man and beast alike, speaks to the extraordinary life Daniel lived, and the love he inspired in all who knew him. A few people murmured in agreement. Sarah turned slightly in her pew, looking back at Max. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. Daniel had loved that dog with a fierceness that had sometimes surprised her. He'd talked to Max like he was human, had shared his thoughts and fears and hopes with the German Shepherd in a way he sometimes couldn't with other people. She'd been jealous at first. She could admit that now. Jealous of the easy companionship, the uncomplicated loyalty. But over time, she'd come to understand that Max wasn't replacing her. He was completing Daniel in a different way, making him whole in places where human love couldn't quite reach. The priest continued with the liturgy, his voice rising and falling in the familiar cadences of ritual. But Max's whining persisted, weaving through the words like a counter-melody of sorrow. Bryant knelt down beside the dog, his dress uniform creaking slightly. "What is it, buddy?" he whispered, looking into those intelligent brown eyes. "I know you miss him. We all do." But something in Max's expression made Bryant pause. There was an intensity there, a focus that went beyond simple grief. Max's gaze was locked on the casket with laser-like precision, his body tense, coiled. Bryant had seen that look before, during searches, during drug busts, during those critical moments when Max had detected something everyone else had missed. This wasn't just mourning, this was something else. The whine transformed into a bark, short, sharp, cutting through Father O'Connor's words like a knife. The priest stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening. Heads turned throughout the chapel. Sarah gasped softly. "I'm sorry, Father," Bryant said quickly, standing and trying to guide Max toward the side door. "Let me just—" But Max planted his paws, refusing to budge. His 75 pounds of muscle and bone became an immovable object. Another bark erupted from him, louder this time, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The sound was primal, urgent, nothing like his usual disciplined responses. "Officer Bryant?" "Perhaps it would be best," Father O'Connor began, but he was cut off by a third bark, this one so forceful that Max's entire body seemed to convulse with the effort. Something was wrong. Even those who'd never been around working dogs could sense it now. This wasn't grief-stricken confusion. This was deliberate, purposeful. Max's tail, which had been tucked low since the service began, suddenly stiffened into a rigid line. His ears shot forward, alert and focused. The fur along his spine began to rise, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Not aggressive, but warning. Alert. Bryant's police instincts kicked in. He'd learned long ago to trust his gut, and right now, his gut was screaming that something wasn't right. He scanned the crowd quickly, looking for threats, for anything out of place. But everyone present was either a cop, a family member, or a longtime friend. No strangers, no danger. So why was Max acting like he'd detected a threat? The German Shepherd suddenly lunged forward, breaking free from Bryant's loose grip. Gasps rippled through the assembled mourners as Max bounded toward the casket, his claws scraping against the polished hardwood floor. He didn't jump on the casket, his training was too ingrained for that, but he circled it, nose working overtime, sniffing along the base, the sides, underneath. "Max!" Bryant called sharply, moving after him. "Max! Heel!" But the dog ignored him completely, something he'd never done before. Max had been Daniel's partner for 6 years, had hundreds of hours of training, had perfect discipline. He didn't break commands. Ever. The barking intensified, becoming almost frantic. Max placed his front paws on the floor and his rear end in the air, tail wagging slightly, the classic playbow, except there was nothing playful about his demeanor. He barked again, directly at the base of the casket, then resumed his circling, whining, sniffing. People began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Whispered conversations started up, speculation and concern mixing in the air. Sarah stood up, her face pale, one hand pressed to her chest. "What's wrong with him?" someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. Is he having a breakdown? Another voice wondered. But the veteran officers present, the ones who'd worked with K-9 units, were beginning to recognize something familiar in Max's behavior. Sergeant Rachel Thompson, who ran the department's K-9 program, rose from her seat near the back, her eyes narrowing as she watched Max work. She'd seen this before. This wasn't distress. This wasn't confusion. This was an alert. Max was indicating on something. But what? And where? The German shepherd paused at one specific spot near the foot of the casket, his nose pressed against the wood, his entire body vibrating with intensity. He barked 3 times in rapid succession, sharp, insistent, demanding attention. Then he began to paw at the casket itself, his claws leaving faint scratches in the glossy finish. "Stop him!" someone cried out. "He's damaging!" But Bryant held up a hand, silencing the protest. He approached Max slowly, deliberately, watching the dog's body language the way Daniel had taught him. Max's tail was still elevated. His ears were forward. His pupils were dilated. These were all signs of a positive alert, the kind of response canines gave when they'd found what they were trained to detect. But Daniel hadn't hidden drugs or explosives in his own casket. That would be insane. So what was Max trying to tell them? Bryant knelt down beside the dog again, placing both hands on Max's powerful shoulders. "Show me, boy," he said softly, the command handlers used when they wanted their canines to refocus. "Show me what you've got." Max stopped barking. He looked directly into Bryant's eyes, and in that moment, Bryant felt a chill run down his spine. The intelligence in that gaze was unmistakable, almost human in its intensity. Then Max turned back to the casket, whined once, a sound that somehow conveyed both urgency and pleading, and placed his paw gently against the wood, right there, right at that spot. Bryant leaned closer, his ear near the base of the casket. The chapel had fallen into an eerie silence, everyone holding their breath. Even Father O'Connor had stopped trying to restore order, watching the scene unfold with the same shocked curiosity as everyone else. And that's when Bryant heard it. A sound so faint, so impossible that at first he thought he'd imagined it. A tiny, muffled noise coming from inside the casket. A whimper. A cry. Something alive. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. Part 3. The Impossible Discovery. "Open it," Bryant said, his voice cutting through the silence like a gunshot. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The words hung in the air, too shocking to process. The funeral director, a thin man named Richard Morrison who'd been standing discreetly near the back, stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion. "I beg your pardon, officer?" "Open the casket," Bryant repeated, standing now, his tone brooking no argument. "Open it now." Gasps erupted throughout the chapel. Sarah's mother let out a small cry of distress. Father O'Connor made the sign of the cross, his lips moving in silent prayer. "Officer Bryant, I can't possibly—" Harold began, his voice taking on a slightly affronted tone. "There are protocols, regulations. The family would have to open it now." Bryant's voice dropped to a dangerous level, the kind of tone that made suspects reconsider their life choices. His hand moved instinctively toward his hip, where his service weapon would normally be, though, of course, he wasn't armed at a funeral. Sergeant Martinez was moving down the aisle now, her face set in grim determination. She'd heard the edge in Bryant's voice, had seen the way Max was behaving. Something was very, very wrong. "Harold," she said firmly, reaching the front of the chapel. "Open the casket. That's not a request." The funeral director looked between them, then at the assembled crowd, then at Sarah, who had risen to her feet, her face bone white, her hands trembling. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "What's wrong? What did he hear?" Bryant turned to her, his eyes filled with something between hope and horror. "Mrs. Granger, I heard something. Inside the casket. Something moving." The chapel erupted into chaos. Voices rose in disbelief, in outrage, in fear. Some people stood, craning their necks to see. Others clutched at their neighbors, seeking comfort or explanation. A few officers moved forward instinctively, their training kicking in despite not knowing what threat they were responding to. "That's impossible!" someone shouted. "This is sacrilege!" another voice cried. "Everyone calm down!" Sergeant Martinez's command voice cut through the noise like a whip crack. "Officers, keep everyone back. Mr. Pembroke, open the casket immediately or I will do it myself." Harold's hands shook as he fumbled for his keys. The casket was sealed, standard procedure for funerals, and it took him 3 tries to get the key into the small lock at the base. Throughout it all, Max remained perfectly still, perfectly focused, his eyes never leaving that one spot on the casket. Sarah moved forward as if in a dream, her legs somehow carrying her despite feeling like they belonged to someone else. Daniel's mother grabbed her arm. Whether to support her or hold her back, Sarah wasn't sure. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard it hurt. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel, everything around her going fuzzy and distant except for that mahogany box that held her husband's body. What could possibly be inside? What had Max detected? Her mind ran through possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Had Daniel not actually been dead when they closed the casket? Had there been some terrible mistake? But no. She'd been at the hospital when they'd pronounced him. She'd watched the flat line on the monitor, had heard the time of death called. He was gone. He was gone. He was... The lock clicked open. Harold's face had gone gray. His hands trembled so badly that Martinez had to gently push him aside and take over. She positioned herself at the head of the casket, glanced once at Bryant for confirmation, then slowly, carefully, began to lift the lid. The hinges creaked, a sound that seemed supernaturally loud in the breathless silence. Inch by inch, the lid rose, revealing the white satin lining, the carefully arranged funeral flowers, Sarah's knees buckled. Someone screamed, because there, nestled in the crook of Daniel's folded arms, partially hidden by the dress uniform jacket they'd buried him in, was a tiny, squirming creature covered in damp fur. A puppy. A newborn German shepherd puppy, its eyes still sealed shut, its miniature paws paddling weakly at the air, its mouth opening in a silent cry that suddenly became very, very audible as fresh air hit its lungs. The sound, that impossibly small, heartbreakingly fragile cry, seemed to crack something open in the universe. Time stuttered. Reality shifted. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. And yet there it was, undeniably alive, undeniably present. Max's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The rigid alertness melted into something gentler, more tender. He rose on his hind legs, placed his front paws carefully on the edge of the casket, and let out a soft whine, not of distress, but of relief. His tail began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. He lowered his massive head and very gently, with the careful precision only a working dog possesses, nuzzled the tiny puppy with his nose. The puppy responded immediately, turning toward Max's scent, its little mouth opening and closing, searching for warmth, for food, for comfort. "Oh my God," Martinez breathed, her composure cracking for the first time. "Oh my God, Fo. There's a puppy in the casket." Bryant moved forward on autopilot, his training overriding his shock. "We need to get it out, carefully. It's probably hypothermic, dehydrated." His voice sounded strange in his own ears, disconnected from his body. He reached into the casket, his hands surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. The puppy was so small it fit easily in his palms, weighing maybe a pound, maybe less. Its fur was damp and matted, its body cold to the touch. As he lifted it, something else became visible. A piece of paper, folded and tucked partially beneath Daniel's jacket. Martinez saw it at the same moment. "There's something else," she said, her voice tight. "A note." She reached in and carefully extracted the paper, being mindful not to disturb Daniel's body more than necessary. The paper was white, slightly creased, and in the top corner, in Daniel's familiar handwriting, were 4 words that made her breath catch. "If anything happens to me." The chapel had gone from chaos to stunned silence. People were standing now, pushing forward to see, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Father O'Connor had his hands pressed to his mouth, tears streaming down his weathered face. Sarah's mother had collapsed back into the pew, being fanned by concerned neighbors. Officers stood frozen, their minds struggling to process the impossible scene before them. And Sarah had somehow made it to the casket, her hands gripping the edge so hard her knuckles were white. She stared down at Daniel's face, peaceful in death, and then at the impossibly small puppy now cradled in Bryant's hands. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What did you do?" Bryant turned to her, the puppy beginning to squirm more insistently in his grasp, its tiny cries growing stronger. "Mrs. Granger, I think your husband left us a message." Martinez held up the note, her hands shaking slightly. "Would you like me to read it?" Sarah couldn't speak. She could only nod, her eyes never leaving the puppy, this impossible, miraculous creature that had been hidden in her husband's final resting place. Martinez unfolded the paper, smoothed it out, and began to read aloud, her voice wavering with emotion. Part 4. Daniel's Last Words. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home." The words hit the assembled mourners like a physical force. Several people let out involuntary cries. Sarah's knees gave out completely, and Daniel's father caught her, holding her upright as tears streamed down both their faces. Martinez's voice broke, but she cleared her throat and continued. "I'm writing this by firelight, in what I know are probably my last hours. Max is beside me, keeping me warm. He refuses to leave even though I've ordered him to go, to save himself. That's the kind of partner he is. That's the kind of loyalty most people never experience in their entire lives." Max whined softly at the sound of his name, his ears twitching, as if he could hear Daniel's voice in the words. 3 days ago, Max and I were tracking a fugitive through the North Woods. We got separated from backup during a storm. I won't go into details about what happened. That doesn't matter now. What matters is that in my last radio call, I told dispatch we were holed up in an old hunting cabin, that we'd wait out the weather. What I didn't tell them was that I was hurt. Badly. Sarah let out a sob, pressing her fist against her mouth. She'd listened to that radio call a dozen times after they'd found Daniel's body. She'd heard the calm in his voice, the professionalism. She'd never suspected he was dying. Max knew, though. Dogs always know. He stayed pressed against me, sharing his warmth, licking my face when I started to drift off, keeping me awake as long as he could. Good boy. Such a good boy. Martinez had to pause, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Several officers in the crowd were openly weeping now. Even the civilians who'd never met Daniel, who'd just come to pay respects to a fallen officer, found themselves gripped by the intimacy of this final message. On the second night, or maybe it was the third, I'd lost track, Max did something I didn't expect. He left me. Just for a little while. I was angry at first, thought maybe he'd finally given up. But then he came back, and he wasn't alone. The puppy in Bryant's hands let out a particularly loud cry, and he instinctively pulled it closer to his chest, trying to provide warmth. He brought her to me, this impossibly small, wet, shivering creature. At first I thought he'd found her somewhere in the cabin, that maybe she'd been abandoned. But then I understood. Max had gone out into the storm and found a female dog, wild, feral maybe, who was giving birth. She was dying. She'd already delivered 2 pups that were dead, and this one, this tiny fighter, was barely hanging on. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The pieces were starting to come together, though the picture they formed seemed too incredible to believe. Max brought her to me, placed her in my lap, and then went back out. When he returned, he had scraps of cloth he'd torn from something, maybe an old blanket he'd found, and he laid them around us, making a nest, trying to save her, trying to save us both. I did what I could. Cleared her airway, dried her off, kept her warm against my skin. She was so small, barely bigger than my hand, but she was alive, fighting. And I thought, if I'm going to die out here, at least I can make sure she doesn't. At least that's something. Martinez's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. People leaned forward, straining to hear every word of this impossible, heartbreaking story. The girl, because I knew she was a girl, don't ask me how, she made it through that night. And the next one, drinking what little I could give her from melted snow, tucked inside my jacket against my chest. Max never left us. He'd lie with his back against the door, guarding us, then come curl around both of us when the cold got too bad. He was magnificent. He is magnificent. The present tense made everyone's breath catch, as if Daniel was still alive somewhere, still writing these words. By the 4th day, I knew I wasn't going to make it. My fever had broken, but I was too weak to move. Couldn't feel my legs anymore. Couldn't stay awake for more than a few minutes at a time. But she was still alive. This tiny miracle was still breathing, still warm, still fighting. So I wrote this note. And I made a decision. Martinez paused, looking up at the crowd, then at Sarah, then back at the paper. I know how strange this is going to seem. I know you're going to think I lost my mind out there, that the fever made me irrational. Maybe it did. But I made Max understand, and he did understand, I swear to God he did, that if anything happened to me, he needed to protect her, get her to safety, make sure someone found her. I didn't know how that would happen. Didn't know if Max would carry her out or lead rescuers back or what. But I trusted him. I trusted that the bond we'd built over 6 years meant he'd understand what I was asking. Bryant looked down at the puppy, then over at Max, who sat perfectly still at attention, his eyes moving between the baby in Bryant's hands and Daniel's still form in the casket. The depth of love and loyalty in that simple action, following his partner's final command, was almost too much to bear. If you're reading this, it means Max succeeded. It means you found her. Please, please take care of her. She didn't ask to be born in a storm, didn't ask to lose her mother, didn't ask for any of this. But she fought so hard to live, harder than I'm fighting right now if I'm being honest. She deserves a chance, a real chance. Sarah. At the sound of her name, Sarah let out a wail that seemed to come from the very center of her soul. Her father-in-law held her tighter, his own tears falling into her hair. Sarah, I'm sorry I can't come home. Sorry I can't keep the promises I made. But if you can find it in your heart, if it's not too painful, please take care of this girl. Raise her with Max. Let them be a family. They saved each other out there in ways I'll never be able to fully explain. And Max, my partner, my brother, my friend, thank you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for trying. Thank you for understanding what I couldn't put into words. You're the best partner I could have ever asked for. To whoever found this, I know it sounds insane, but I need you to understand something. I hid her in the casket because I knew it was the only way Max would be allowed near her, allowed to complete his mission. I knew he'd alert. I knew he'd make you open it. because that's what he does. He finds what's hidden. He saves lives, even when that life is impossibly small and impossibly fragile. This isn't about me anymore. This is about her, about making sure something good comes from something terrible, about making sure that in my last moments, I did something that mattered. Please, take care of them. Officer Michael Carter, badge number 219. Martinez's voice finally gave out completely on the last line. She lowered the letter, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The paper trembled in her hands as if alive with the emotion it contained. The silence that followed was profound, sacred. It was the kind of silence that exists in the space between heartbeats, in the pause before a baby's first breath, in the moment before dawn breaks. Everyone present felt it, the weight of what they'd witnessed, the impossibility made real, the sacrifice made eternal. Father O'Connor crossed himself again, his weathered face streaming with tears. "In all my years," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "in all my years serving the Lord, I have never witnessed such a miracle, such love, such faith." Bryant looked down at the puppy in his hands. She had stopped crying, was nestling against his chest, finding warmth at last. Her tiny paws kneaded against his uniform, and he could feel her heartbeat, rapid and strong and alive, pulsing against his palms. "Max," he said softly, turning to face the German shepherd. "You did it, boy. You completed your mission. You saved her." Max's tail began to wag, slowly at first, then faster. He approached Bryant, stood on his hind legs again, and very carefully sniffed the puppy. His tongue came out, giving her one gentle lick on the top of her tiny head. It was a gesture of such tender protectiveness that several people in the crowd openly broke down. Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out raw and broken. "Let me hold her, please. Let me hold my husband's final gift." Bryant moved to her immediately, carefully transferring the precious bundle from his hands to hers. Sarah cradled the puppy against her chest in almost the exact same position Daniel must have held her, and looked down into that tiny, wrinkled face. The puppy's eyes were still sealed shut, wouldn't open for another week at least. But somehow, she seemed to sense that she was safe now, that the long nightmare of cold and hunger and isolation was over. She let out a small, contented sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a sigh, and relaxed completely in Sarah's arms. "She's so small," Sarah whispered, tears falling onto the puppy's fur. "She's so small and so perfect, and Daniel saved her. My Daniel saved her life." Max pressed against Sarah's leg, and she looked down at him. This magnificent creature who had refused to give up, who had understood what his partner needed, who had completed a mission that went beyond training, beyond commands, into something deeper and more primal. "You too," she said to Max, her voice breaking. "You saved her too. You're both heroes, both of you." Chapter Part 5. The Promise Kept. The funeral service never resumed. How could it? What words could possibly follow what had just been revealed? Instead, it transformed into something else, a vigil, a celebration, a testament to the extraordinary bond between a man and his dog and the life they'd saved together. People gathered around Sarah, Max, and the puppy, creating a protective circle. Officers who'd served with Daniel told stories, some funny, some poignant, all revealing pieces of the man they'd lost. Sergeant Martinez called the K-9 unit's veterinarian, Dr. Lisa Reynolds, who rushed over from her Sunday afternoon at home, still wearing sweatpants under her coat. Dr. Chen examined the puppy right there in the chapel, on a table hastily cleared of funeral programs and order of service cards. Her skilled hands moved over the tiny body, checking vitals, assessing condition, determining what miracles of survival had occurred in that sealed mahogany box. "Severe dehydration," she announced, her voice clinical but her eyes soft. "Mild hypothermia. She's underweight, probably hasn't eaten since she was born. But her lungs sound clear, her heart is strong, and she's responsive." She looked up at Sarah, at Bryant, at the assembled crowd. "She's going to make it. Against all odds, this little fighter is going to make it." The words seemed to break a dam. People who'd been holding themselves together finally let go, weeping openly, hugging strangers, finding comfort in shared witness to something inexplicable. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. This was about hope in the face of loss, about life persisting against impossible odds, about love that extended beyond death. Dr. Chen set up an IV line, tiny, delicate, heartbreakingly small, and began administering fluids. The puppy barely flinched, too exhausted to resist, too weak to do much more than lie still and accept the help being offered. Max never left her side, his eyes tracking every movement Dr. Chen made, as if making sure she was being gentle, making sure his charge was being properly cared for. "How long was she in there?" Dr. Chen asked quietly. "Adjusting the IV drip." Bryant checked his watch, did the mental math. "The casket was sealed yesterday afternoon, after the final viewing. So, roughly 22 hours, give or take." Dr. Chen shook her head in disbelief. "She shouldn't have survived that. The lack of oxygen alone should have—" She stopped, seeming to realize that trying to apply logic to what had happened was pointless. "It's a miracle. That's the only explanation." "Daniel kept her alive in that cabin for days," Sarah said softly, still holding the puppy's tiny paw between her fingers. "Kept her warm, kept her fed somehow. She was already a fighter before she ever went in that casket. He made sure of that." The story spread quickly. Within an hour, the news vans outside had their cameras on, reporters speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the miracle at St. Michael's Chapel. Social media exploded with the hashtag #MaxTheHero. The photo, captured by someone's phone and shared within minutes, of Max with his paw gently resting on the puppy while Sarah held her, went viral before the IV had finished its first bag of fluids. But inside the chapel, away from the media frenzy, something more intimate was happening. Daniel's parents approached Sarah, their faces ravaged by grief, but also touched by wonder. "May we?" his mother asked, gesturing to the puppy. Sarah nodded, carefully transferring the small bundle into the older woman's arms. Daniel's mother, Margaret, looked down at the tiny life her son had saved, and something in her face shifted. The stark grief that had carved lines around her eyes and mouth softened, just slightly, into something that held both sorrow and gratitude. "He was always bringing home strays," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Even as a boy. Birds with broken wings, cats that were too skinny, one time a raccoon that had gotten its head stuck in a jar." She laughed softly through her tears, the sound fragile but genuine. "His father used to say Daniel had too big a heart for his own good." Daniel's father, a retired Marine named William who hadn't cried at his own parents' funerals, reached out with one weathered finger and stroked the puppy's head. A single tear traced down his cheek. "Not too big," he said gruffly. "Just big enough, just exactly big enough." The puppy stirred in Margaret's arms, her tiny mouth opening in a yawn that revealed a pink tongue no bigger than a fingernail. The gesture was so innocent, so full of life and new beginnings, that it seemed to illuminate something in the grief-darkened chapel. This was what Daniel had fought for in his last moments. Not glory, not recognition, but this, the simple, profound act of ensuring life continued. Father O'Connor approached, his liturgical stole still hanging around his neck, his face still wet with tears. "Mrs. Granger," he said gently, "I believe we should conclude the service. Not in the traditional way. I don't think any of us could bear that now. But with a blessing. For Daniel, yes, but also for this new life he protected. For Max, who honored his partner's trust. And for all of us, who have been privileged to witness this profound mystery." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The crowd settled back into the pews, though the atmosphere had completely transformed. There was still sorrow, deep, aching sorrow for a good man gone too soon, but threaded through it now was something else. Hope. Wonder. A sense that death, while having the last word, didn't have the only word. Father O'Connor stood before the casket, where Daniel lay in eternal rest, and raised his hands. "Lord," he began, his Irish brogue thick with emotion, "we came here today to mourn, to say goodbye to a son, a husband, a friend, a protector of this community. We came expecting only darkness, only loss. But you, in your infinite wisdom and mysterious ways, have shown us that even in death, love persists. Even in ending, there are beginnings." Max, still standing guard beside the casket, let out a soft whine. It wasn't distress. It was acknowledgement. Agreement. As if even he understood that something sacred was happening. Bless Michael Carter, beats all, who in his final moments thought not of himself but of the most vulnerable among us. Bless Max, whose loyalty transcends understanding, whose love for his partner moved him to complete an impossible mission. And bless this small one. He gestured toward the puppy, now back in Sarah's arms, who survived against all odds, who carries with her the last acts of Daniel's courage and compassion. May we who remain find strength in this mystery. May we honor Daniel not just by mourning his absence, but by emulating his presence, his selflessness, his dedication, his willingness to put others before himself, even at the very end. Lord, receive your servant Daniel into your arms, and help us to remember that love, true love, is stronger than death. It persists, it protects, it saves. Amen. The word echoed through the chapel, repeated by hundreds of voices in unison, and in that moment, something shifted in the gathered assembly. The weight of grief didn't disappear. It would never disappear, but it became bearable, shared, transformed into something that honored Daniel rather than just mourned him. Part 6. The hours after the chapel slowly emptied as afternoon stretched into evening. People filed past Daniel's casket, paying their final respects, many pausing to look at Max and offer words of admiration, of gratitude, of awe. The German shepherd accepted each touch, each word, with the patient dignity of a dog who understood his importance but didn't seek glory for it. Sarah remained seated in the front pew, the puppy still cradled against her chest, now wrapped in a soft blanket someone had retrieved from their car. Dr. Ayesho Chen had left after ensuring the puppy was stable, promising to return first thing in the morning for a more thorough examination. She'd left detailed instructions, feeding schedule, temperature monitoring, signs to watch for, but had also said something that stuck with Sarah. "That puppy knows you," Dr. Chen had said, watching the way the tiny creature nestled against Sarah's heartbeat. "Knows your scent, your voice." Daniel held her against his chest for days. "You're his wife." On some level, some instinctual level, she recognizes that connection. You smell like home to her. The thought had undone Sarah completely. To think that her husband in his dying hours had held this fragile life against his heart, The same heart she'd fallen asleep listening to for 5 years of marriage, and that now this puppy carried that sense memory. That imprint of Daniel's presence. It was unbearable and beautiful in equal measure. Bryant appeared beside her as the last mourners trickled out. He'd removed his dress jacket, rolled up his sleeves, loosened his tie. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. He sat down heavily beside Sarah, the pew creaking under his weight. "The media's going crazy out there," he said quietly. "Every news station in the state wants to interview you, wants to tell Daniel's story. I can make them go away if you want. Just say the word." Sarah looked down at the puppy, at the tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "Daniel would have hated the attention," she said softly. "He always said the job wasn't about glory. It was about service. About doing what's right because it's right, not because someone's watching." "That's true," Bryant agreed. But he also believed in the power of hope, of showing people that good still exists in the world, that there are still heroes. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This story, what happened today, people need to hear it. Not for sensationalism, for hope, to remember that even in our darkest moments, there's still light." Sarah considered this, her thumb absently stroking the puppy's soft fur. "What do I tell them? How do I explain what Daniel did without making it sound like he was delirious or irrational?" "You tell them the truth," Bryant said simply. "You tell them that your husband, in his final hours, did what he always did. He protected and served, not the department, not the uniform, but life itself. The most vulnerable, innocent life he could find. And that his partner, Max, honored that mission with everything he had." As if hearing his name, Max padded over from where he'd been lying beside the casket. He sat directly in front of Sarah, his eyes moving between her face and the puppy's tiny form. Then he did something unexpected. He laid his head in her lap, right beside the puppy, and let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was the sound of a weight being lifted. A mission completed. A promise kept. Sarah's free hand moved to Max's head, her fingers threading through his thick fur. "You did so good," she whispered to him, her voice breaking. "You did so good, Max. He'd be so proud of you. So proud." Max's tail wagged once, twice, then stilled. His eyes drifted closed, and for the first time in days, his body fully relaxed. He'd been running on adrenaline and duty, refusing to rest until he'd accomplished what Daniel had asked of him. Now, finally, he could let go, could allow himself to be just a dog again, grieving and exhausted and in need of comfort. The three of them sat there in the dimming chapel, a widow, a canine officer, and a newborn puppy, connected by grief and miracle and the invisible thread of Daniel's final act of love. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the stained glass windows in shades of amber and gold. The light fell across Daniel's casket like a benediction. "What will you name her?" Bryant asked after a long silence. Sarah hadn't even thought about it. In the chaos and shock of the discovery, the question of a name had seemed almost trivial. But now, looking down at this impossibly small creature who had survived impossibly dire circumstances, she knew the answer immediately. "Hope," she said softly. "Her name is Hope." Bryant nodded, his own eyes filling with fresh tears. "Yeah," he said roughly. "Yeah, that's perfect." Part 7. The First Night. The police department had offered to take Hope and Max for the night, to give Sarah time to process everything in peace. She'd refused. The thought of being separated from either of them, from these two living connections to Daniel, was unbearable. So arrangements were made quickly. A portable incubator borrowed from the veterinary clinic, puppy formula, bottles so small they looked like doll accessories, heating pads, thermometers, the works. Officer Martinez had driven them home. Sarah, Max, Hope, and enough supplies to fill the back of an SUV. Daniel and Sarah's house sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees, a modest two-bedroom with a fenced yard that Daniel had been meaning to re-stain all summer. The porch light was on. A neighbor had made sure of that. The lawn was freshly mowed, another neighbor's kindness. Walking through the front door was one of the hardest things Sarah had ever done. The house smelled like Daniel. His cologne, the specific detergent he used for his uniforms, the coffee he brewed too strong every morning. His shoes were still by the door, exactly where he'd kicked them off 5 days ago before leaving for what would be his final shift. Max went immediately to those shoes, sniffing them intensely, then let out a long, mournful howl that seemed to contain every emotion he couldn't express in words. The sound was primal, heartbreaking, and Sarah found herself sinking to the floor beside him. Hope still clutched to her chest, and finally, letting herself completely fall apart. She sobbed until there was nothing left, until her throat was raw and her head pounded and her body felt hollowed out. Max pressed against her side, his warmth solid and real and grounding. Hope, perhaps sensing the storm of emotion surrounding her, remained quiet, her tiny body tucked safely against Sarah's heart. Time passed in a blur. Somehow Sarah found herself on the couch, wrapped in one of Daniel's sweatshirts, the incubator set up on the coffee table where he used to prop his feet after long shifts. Hope was inside, curled up on a soft cloth that had been warmed, looking impossibly small and impossibly perfect under the gentle glow of the heat lamp. Max had claimed his usual spot, the dog bed beside the couch, but he'd positioned it so he could see both Sarah and Hope. His eyes tracked every breath the puppy took, every small movement. The vigilance of the last few days hadn't entirely left him. He was still on duty, still protecting, still honoring the trust Daniel had placed in him. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly, texts, calls, social media notifications, but she ignored them all. The only person she'd responded to was her mother, sending a simple text, "I'm home, I'm okay, I need tonight alone." Around midnight, Hope began to cry, a thin, insistent sound that triggered immediate action from Max. He was on his feet before Sarah had fully registered the noise, his nose pressed against the incubator, whining softly. "It's okay, boy," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from crying. "She's probably hungry. Dr. Chen said every 2 hours. She carefully lifted Hope from the incubator, marveling again at how something so small could be so perfectly formed. Tiny paws, tiny ears, tiny everything. She settled back on the couch and began the feeding process Dr. Chen had demonstrated, supporting Hope's head, offering the bottle at the right angle, being patient as the puppy figured out how to latch onto the unfamiliar nipple. It took several tries, but eventually Hope began to nurse, her small mouth working steadily, her eyes still sealed shut, but her whole body focused on the task of survival. Max watched intently, his tail wagging slightly whenever Hope made a satisfied sound. "Daniel saved you," Sarah whispered to the nursing puppy. "Against all odds, in his last moments, he made sure you lived. Do you know how special that makes you? Do you know what a gift you are?" Hope's only response was to keep drinking, her tiny paws kneading the air in contentment. When the bottle was empty, Sarah burped her carefully. A surreal experience, burping a puppy like a human infant, and then held her close, just feeling the warmth, the aliveness, the miracle. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted to Max, who had moved closer, his head now resting on the couch cushion beside her. "I don't know how to be a widow at 26. I don't know how to raise a newborn puppy. I don't know how to live in a world without Daniel in it." Max's eyes, those intelligent, soulful eyes that had seen things most dogs never would, held hers steadily. And in that moment, Sarah understood something Daniel must have known. She wasn't alone. She would never be alone, because Daniel had left her the two best partners anyone could ask for, a loyal protector and a symbol of hope. "We'll figure it out together," she said, her hand moving to scratch behind Max's ears. "The three of us. We'll figure it out." Part 8. The Days That Followed. Hope thrived. Against all medical expectations, despite her traumatic start, she grew stronger with each passing day. By the end of the first week, her eyes had opened, brown like Max's, like Daniel's had been, and she'd begun to show personality. She was feisty, demanding, and utterly unafraid of Max despite his size. Max, for his part, had transformed. The grief-stricken, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by something softer. Purpose. He'd appointed himself Hope's guardian, watching over her sleep, gently nudging her when she wandered too far, even attempting to clean her the way a mother dog would. It was clear he saw her as his responsibility, the final mission Daniel had entrusted to him. Sarah documented everything: photos, videos, journal entries, partly because people wanted to know how the miracle puppy was doing, but mostly because she needed to create a record of this impossible thing that had happened, this gift Daniel had somehow managed to give her from beyond death. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. Sarah had given exactly one interview, to a local reporter she trusted, someone who'd known Daniel, and told the full story. The video had been picked up nationally, then internationally. Millions of people watched her explain, through tears, what her husband had done in his final hours. Watched Max demonstrate how he'd alerted at the funeral. Watched Hope, tiny and perfect, sleeping peacefully in her incubator. The response had been extraordinary. Letters poured in from around the world, from other officers who'd lost partners, from families grieving their own losses, from people who just needed to be reminded that goodness still existed. Donations flooded into the K-9 unit in Daniel's name. A best-selling author offered to write a book about Max and Daniel's partnership. Hollywood called about film rights. Sarah turned down most of it. But she did accept an invitation to appear at the Police Academy's graduation ceremony, where a new award was being established in Daniel's honor. The Officer Michael Carter Award for Selfless Service, to be given to cadets who demonstrated extraordinary compassion and commitment to protecting the vulnerable. She stood at the podium, Hope sleeping in a carrier against her chest, Max sitting at attention beside her, and looked out at the sea of young, eager faces. "My husband never wanted to be famous," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion churning in her chest. "He wanted to make a difference. There's a distinction there that matters. Fame is about recognition. Making a difference is about impact, about leaving the world better than you found it, even in small, quiet ways that no one might ever know about." She paused, her hand moving to rest on Hope's tiny back. Daniel's last act wasn't captured on camera. There were no witnesses, no one to see his sacrifice, his determination to protect a life that couldn't protect itself. He did it because it was right, because he was who he was, a protector, a servant, a man who understood that every life has value. The graduates sat in rapt silence, hanging on every word. "Some of you will have moments like that in your careers," Sarah continued. "Moments where no one's watching, where there's no recognition or reward, where doing the right thing is harder than walking away. In those moments, I hope you'll remember Daniel. Remember that true heroism isn't about glory. It's about showing up, even when no one's looking, especially when no one's looking." She looked down at Max, who looked back at her with those wise, knowing eyes. "And remember that partnerships, whether with a fellow officer, a K-9, or the community you serve, are built on trust. On loyalty that goes beyond rules and regulations into something deeper. Daniel trusted Max to understand his final wish, and Max honored that trust beyond anything we could have imagined." When she finished speaking, The applause wasn't the usual polite clapping of a formal ceremony. It was a standing ovation that went on for 5 full minutes, with not a dry eye in the auditorium. Part 9. 3 months later, Hope was no longer the tiny, fragile creature that had been discovered in a coffin. At 3 months old, she was all paws and ears, clumsy and energetic and utterly convinced that Max existed solely for her entertainment. She'd chew on his tail, bounce on his back while he was trying to sleep, steal his toys. And Max tolerated all of it with the patient indulgence of a father who'd waited his whole life for a child. Sarah had returned to work. She was a teacher, 3rd grade, and her students had sent hundreds of cards and drawings after Daniel's death. Walking back into her classroom had been hard, but necessary. Life, she was learning, didn't stop for grief. It accommodated it, made space for it, but it kept moving forward. She'd established a routine. Mornings were for Hope's training. She'd decided to raise her as a K-9 to honor Daniel's legacy. Afternoons were for teaching. Evenings were for the 3 of them, Sarah, Max, and Hope, being a family in their quiet house under the oak trees. The department had wanted to retire Max, to let him live out his remaining years in peace, but Sarah had advocated for something different. Let him train Hope. Give him purpose beyond grief. Let him pass on everything Daniel had taught him to the next generation. The chief had been skeptical at first, but watching Max work with Hope, patient, firm, encouraging, had convinced him. Max was a natural teacher, and Hope was an eager student. More than that, they needed each other. Needed the structure, the purpose, the continuation of the work that had defined both their lives. One Saturday afternoon in late fall, Sarah took them both to the cemetery. Daniel's grave was simple, a flat granite marker in a section reserved for fallen officers. His name, his badge number, his dates. Such a small space to contain such a large life. She sat on the grass, Hope tumbling around in the fallen leaves, Max lying beside the headstone with his head on his paws. The afternoon sun was warm, the air crisp with the promise of coming winter. She'd brought flowers, sunflowers, Daniel's favorite, and a thermos of coffee to share with him, the way she used to on lazy Sunday mornings. "Hope's doing really well," she told Daniel's headstone, her voice conversational, as if he might answer back. "She's stubborn, like you were. Determined. She doesn't give up on anything, even when she should probably just let it go. Max thinks she's going to be an incredible K-9. Better than either of you, he says." She smiled, imagining Daniel's mock outrage at that suggestion. "I'm doing okay," she continued, her smile fading. "Some days are harder than others. I still reach for my phone to text you when something funny happens. Still set out 2 coffee mugs in the morning sometimes before I remember, but I'm not drowning anymore. I'm learning to swim in this new reality." Hope bounded over, her puppy energy seemingly endless, and dropped a stick at Sarah's feet. It was twice her size, something she'd dragged from who knows where, and she looked absurdly proud of herself. "She has your determination," Sarah said, picking up the stick and tossing it a short distance. Hope bounded after it, tripping over her own feet in her enthusiasm. "And your heart. Max makes sure of that. He's teaching her everything you taught him, not just commands and procedures, but the important stuff. The stuff about protecting people who can't protect themselves, about doing right even when it's hard, about loyalty that goes beyond duty into love." Max had raised his head, watching Hope play, his tail wagging slightly. In the 3 months since Daniel's death, Sarah had seen Max transform from a grief-stricken dog barely eating, barely functioning, into something more complete than he'd been before, as if saving Hope had saved him too. "You knew," Sarah said softly, looking at the headstone. "Somehow, you knew that we'd need her, that Max would need a purpose beyond mourning, that I'd need something to pour my love into, something that connected me to you. How did you know?" The wind rustled the leaves, sending a cascade of gold and red tumbling across the grass. Hope pounced on them, barking her high-pitched puppy bark, and Max let out a soft woof of encouragement. "The department wants to do a memorial," Sarah said, pulling her jacket tighter against the breeze. "1-year anniversary. They want Max and Hope to be part of it. Want to tell your story again." I said yes. "I hope that's okay. I know you'd hate the attention, but people need to hear it, Daniel. They need to know that heroes still exist, that love is stronger than death, that sacrifice means something." She fell silent, watching Hope and Max play, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the ache in her heart that had become as familiar as breathing. "I miss you," she finally whispered. "Every single day I miss you, but I'm so grateful for what you left me, for Max, who's been my rock, for Hope, who's been my reason to keep going, for the reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's still light." Hope had tired herself out and came trotting back, collapsing in Sarah's lap in a heap of puppy exhaustion. Within seconds, she was asleep, her tiny body twitching with dreams. Max moved closer, pressing his solid warmth against Sarah's side. The three of them sat there as afternoon stretched into evening, a small family bound together by loss and love and one man's final extraordinary act of compassion. The sun set in shades of orange and pink, painting the sky the colors of hope renewed. And somewhere, Sarah liked to believe, Daniel was watching over them all, satisfied with his last mission completed, his final gift delivered, his love persisting beyond the boundaries of life and death. Epilogue. 2 years later, the graduation ceremony for Class 47 of the K-9 Training Academy was being held outdoors, on a beautiful spring morning when the world seemed impossibly green and alive. Rows of chairs faced a small platform where the chief stood, preparing to award certificates to the newest teams joining the force. In the front row sat Sarah, her hand resting on the head of a 2-year-old German shepherd who sat at perfect attention, her vest reading K-9 in training. Hope had grown into a magnificent dog, strong, intelligent, focused, every inch her father's daughter and her mentor's student. She'd inherited Max's intensity and Daniel's compassion, making her exactly the kind of officer the department needed. Beside them sat Max, now officially retired but present for every important moment in Hope's training. He was grayer around the muzzle, moved a little slower, but his eyes were still sharp, still proud. He'd accomplished what Daniel had asked of him. He'd protected Hope, raised her, trained her, and prepared her for the work that was in her blood. "Officer Hope Granger," the chief announced, reading from his notes, "has completed her K-9 training with the highest marks in her class. Her specialties are search and rescue, narcotics detection, and community outreach. She will be partnered with Officer James Parker Bryant, carrying on the legacy of her father and his partner." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, happy tears this time, as Bryant stood and walked to the platform. He'd requested to be Hope's handler, had even postponed his own retirement to make it happen. It felt right, this continuation. Bryant had been Daniel's partner before Max. Now he'd be Max's pupil's partner. The circle completed itself. Hope and Bryant took the stage together, moving as one unit, their training evident in every synchronized step. The chief draped a new vest over Hope's shoulders, a full police vest, no longer marked in training. Badge number 347H, in honor of Daniel's original number. The crowd applauded, but Sarah's eyes were on Max. The old German shepherd was watching Hope with an expression that could only be described as paternal pride. His tail wagged, slow and steady. His posture was relaxed in a way it hadn't been in years. This was what he'd been working toward, what Daniel had asked of him. Hope was ready. His mission was truly complete. After the ceremony, people gathered around to congratulate the new K-9 teams, to share stories and take photos. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, approached Sarah shyly, her mother a few steps behind. "Are you Mrs. Granger?" the girl asked, her voice small but determined. "I am," Sarah said gently, kneeling down to the girl's level. "My daddy's a police officer," the girl said. "He told me about your husband, about how he saved Hope. He says that's what real heroes do. They help people even when it's hard, even when no one's watching." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Your daddy's right," she managed to say. "That's exactly what real heroes do." The girl considered this, then said with the simple wisdom of children, "I think Hope is going to save lots of people, because your husband saved her first. It's like the helping keeps going." "Yeah," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Yeah, sweetie, the helping keeps going." The girl's mother mouthed, "Thank you," over her daughter's head, her own eyes wet, and gently guided her child away. Sarah stood, watching them go, feeling the truth of what that little girl had said settle into her bones. The helping does keep going. Love does persist. Sacrifice does echo forward, touching lives that will never know the original source, creating ripples that extend far beyond what any one person can see. Daniel had saved Hope in his final moments. Hope would go on to save others. Those others would help more people still. The chain of compassion, started in a freezing cabin by a dying man and his loyal dog, would extend forward into a future Daniel would never see, but had helped create. That evening, Sarah sat on her back porch, watching Hope and Max play in the yard. Hope was gentler now with the old dog, seeming to understand that his joints ached, that he tired more easily. She'd bring him toys instead of stealing them, would lie beside him in the sun instead of pouncing on his head. Max, for his part, seemed content in a way Sarah had never seen before. His life's work was done. He'd been the best partner a cop could ask for. He'd honored his handler's final wish beyond all reasonable expectation. He'd raised a puppy into a canine officer who would make a difference in the world. As the sun set, painting the sky in those familiar shades of orange and pink. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled to a photo she kept, the last one taken of Daniel, Max, and herself together. They'd been at a department barbecue, all 3 of them squinting into the sun, smiling. It had been 2 weeks before Daniel died. 2 weeks before everything changed. She studied Daniel's face, trying to see if there had been any hint of what was to come, any shadow of his approaching death. But there was nothing except joy, love, and the easy confidence of a man who didn't know his time was running out. Maybe that was better. Maybe not knowing meant his last days were fully lived rather than spent in fear or regret. "Thank you," she whispered to the photo, to the memory, to the ghost of the man she'd loved and would always love. "Thank you for them. Thank you for giving me a reason to keep going. Thank you for showing me that love doesn't end with death. It just changes form." Hope bounded up the porch steps, tired from playing, and collapsed at Sarah's feet with a contented sigh. Max followed more slowly, settling beside them both, his head resting on Sarah's knee. The 3 of them sat there as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, a family forged in tragedy and held together by love. And somewhere, Sarah liked to imagine, Daniel was watching over them all, satisfied with how his final mission had turned out, proud of the legacy he'd left behind. The helping keeps going, the love persists, and hope, against all odds, impossibly resilient, survives. In loving memory of all the officers and canines who have given their lives in service, and in celebration of the bonds between humans and animals that transcend understanding. May we all find the courage to protect the vulnerable, even in our darkest hours. May we all find partners who honor our trust beyond reason. And may we all remember that every life, no matter how small, no matter how fragile, has infinite value and deserves to be saved. Badge number 219, Officer Michael Carter, gone but never forgotten.